Hello, welcome to our channel. We are Love Surf Connect, and I'm Alfredina. I'm here with my husband, Jorge, and we're going to have a little chat about taking the promised land. So, this is the person that I talk to whenever I'm confused, whenever I don't understand or I'm struggling with a concept. And recently, I was thinking about the promised land, how the way that mind you, I've been hearing the story since I was a little girl. So there was the expectations sometimes that you have to challenge within yourself depending of how long you've been thinking on a topic. And the topic of the promised land to me was the first introduction of it to me was in children's church, right? So God rescues the Israelites and brings them over to the promised land. But as an adult, I had this realization that when they got to the border and the ones that made it, because not even Moses made it, they then had to take it. So, just in case you're not familiar with the story, how about we give them a little Cliff Notes version of
Right.
this story?
I'd say that the Exodus narrative is one of my favorite in the entire Bible, and it really helps to structure the rest of the Christian experience, the believer experience. Um, in practical terms, the story is the people of Israelites are the descendants of Joseph and the entire family of Jacob. And so Jacob's family grows in Egypt, and what ends up happening is the people are ended up they end up being enslaved because the Pharaoh is afraid of an uprising. And so the people now being enslaved for over 400 years, they've been crying out to the Lord. And God hears their cry and he sends them somebody to free them. And that somebody is Moses. Moses formerly had been a prince, so to speak, in Egypt, or at least the daughter of the princess in the Egyptian structure. And so, but Pharaoh's daughter, right? So, but now he's been living in the desert. He's been tending sheep. He's been separated from Egypt for a while, and God calls him to go back to Egypt to liberate the people. And so it's this fascinating, amazing story. God, with a mighty strong hand, frees the Israelites from Egyptian oppression and from slavery, essentially. They leave Egypt and they go through this time in the desert. The trip itself would have taken them 11 days, but they end up there for 40 years. And part of the reason was because when they sent out scouts initially, and the scouts brought back the report, they sent out 10 scouts. 8 of them didn't believe that the land could be inhabited and taken. But 2 of them said, "We can take it if God is with us, and we believe that he is and that he will give us this land, and that it's flowing with milk and honey and all this stuff." But the other spies were like, "You know what? This is not takeable." It might have been 10 spies, so we'll fact check that.
It
But
was one per tribe.
yeah, there's probably 12 in total, and then like 10 said no. So we'll definitely fact check that. But the point is that there was an overwhelming majority that didn't believe that they could take the land, and 2 of them believed that they could.
Let's pause because just recounting it is a fascinating story, like you say. So we go back. Let's go back to just the Exodus. God doesn't just take them out by making it what am I trying to say?
He doesn't just
He doesn't just
pull them out.
passively pull them out. He displays his power. Like we had water turning into blood, we had locusts, and it wasn't just because we've all been we're living in Florida. We know what it's like to get run over by ants. Like they just appear and they're everywhere. If you don't treat them, they take over. He didn't just show his power in that there were this plagues coming of frogs or flies or whatever. He also showed the power in getting rid of them. As quick as he brought them, he could take them back. And then it finally culminated with this grand like miracle of separating a whole sea. He is powerful. And he shows, like, the beginning of the story, maybe this is what feeds my misconception, right? That eventually, when they get to the promised land, they're just going to be ushered in. And God is going to take, he would have made it all kind of like creation, right? I always think of creation in the eyes of a parent. Like when you're nesting for your first baby, you're like, let me put the nursery, let me get the crib, the clothing. You have everything ready for this baby. And that's kind of like how creation happened. It's like everything is a mess. Let's turn on the light. Let's make dry land appear. Let's make vegetation. Then let's team up with animals. Like he did everything so that when he created us, everything was there. So I like as reading it as a child and keeping that little, image in my mind of what it was when I was little, I stay with that image that God can and God did this great thing to get them out. But eventually we're gonna get to the promised land. Not even everybody got it. So
Right.
unpause.
So most people believed the 10 spies, I'm pretty sure it's 10 now, right? That said that they couldn't take the land. And so they end up staying in the desert. So it was basically like, all right, well, you think that you can't, then you won't. And they died in the desert. That's how they end up for 40 years wandering in the desert. And so all of that generation dies. And the only people that make it from that generation are Caleb and Joshua.
Who were?
Caleb and Joshua were the two spies who had gone into the land that when they came back, brought back a positive report and said, yes, there are giants. Yes, there are, well reinforced, high walled cities, but God is with us and we can take this land. Right. And so they end up going to the promised land, a generation that were the children essentially of the people who had believed the 10 spies, and they are now going into the promised land, but it's not just given to them. They have to take it. And they have to take it by military conquest.
Yeah. Yeah. That that's hard because there were giants. I feel like the
One of the famous stories, by the way, is David and Goliath, right? Goliath being a remnant of those giants that were living in there. He was a Philistine, which were one of the tribes that were at the time living in Canaan, which weren't eradicated entirely, obviously, and the Philistines ended up being an enormous thorn in the side of the Israelites across history because they hadn't eliminated them the way that they were supposed to.
and they were supposed to because God told them to,
Right.
right? So I think that we see that even with the generation that was left behind, they still like myself. I can't judge them because I'm sitting here like, but they had to fight. Um, so going back to taking the promised land, I love that you're leading with or like you're not forgetting in the grand scheme of things because they didn't even pop into my mind when we were having the conversation originally is the 12 spies, right? They were representing the people, 12 tribes, 12 people, 2 out of the 10. They weren't just talking about the giants. When they came back, they gave great reports. I mean, one of those things that I love to imagine is that they needed a huge pole and 2 adult men to carry one bunch of grapes. Just one grape
Right.
vein.
A ream.
That's how huge these fruits were. So it wasn't just the land of milk and honey. This was especially coming from the desert. And this generation, oh my goodness, they have been enslaved for so long. They didn't have anybody alive who knew what it was like to just live free and go about their lives and their future however they plan. They are seeing how fruitful this land is, how bountiful everything in it is, and how it's thriving. So I think that the call was so big, the enemy was big, but the enemy had been defeated, right? The enemy were the inhabitants, and they had already lost that land because they didn't believe in God. Because God, however He decides these things, was like, okay, you're done. You're doing too much evil. There's too much going on. Your time's up. Now my people are going to come in and inhabit here. So it was that big of a challenge because the land was that good. So I think that on the other side of taking the promised land or receiving a promise, the bigger the promise, the bigger the reward. Sometimes that's how big the the challenge in front of you is gonna be. And
Yeah.
I struggle with that. I think that there are two different types of people in the world. You know, there's the people like the 10 spies that they see the trouble bigger than the reward. And sometimes they would rather just die and give up and turn around and go back to what they knew, which was slavery, than to go in and fight and trust the God that brought you this far. Because they weren't brought that far, like I said, in a passive way. They got brought there and they got to see God's power. And it's that same God that obliterated the Egyptians, which was a world power at the time, that's telling them, "I'm going with you," and they were still like, "Mm-mm." So that's one type of people, and then there's the other type of people, the Joshua and Caleb. So they're like, "What are you talking about? We can do this. We got this. Let's go. Let's fight. We'll take this land. We'll do the thing." And in our marriage, I think that I am that person. Like I can dream big, but as I'm walking that out, when I see a really big challenge, I tend to shrink back and start questioning, well, did God really call me? Did I hear right? Well, if he did, then the door will be open and all this stuff. And I think I'm married to the other side, right? You're just like, biggest mountain, let's go, let's knock it down. How do you know? That's my first question. Like, how do you know when to just take the land, when to just, not see a challenge as God is directing me somewhere else versus go and take it and I'm with you?
Yeah, so, um, wow, that's a good question. I I think that this comes down to, like, how do you know the will of God, you know? Um, and how do you differentiate that will from your own will or from a whim or from a desire or from somebody else's whim or desire, right? So, first of all, I'd say practice. There has to be a practice of, surrender to the will of God. And that will come in the form of you will over time develop that practice as your obedience grows. And so God will present opportunities for obedience where your obedience is kind of like a muscle, And you start off small, like, hey, do this. And you kind of resist at first and then you do it. And then the next time that voice is going to continue, but you'll be able to differentiate it over time with practice. The second thing is what I call a cluster of evidence. So there's usually a cloud. So the people of Israel were literally led by a cloud, right? In the desert, they were led by a cloud that protected them during the day, and there was a pillar of fire that kept them safe at night. And so at night in the desert, it got cold, and so the fire would keep them warm. But in the day, it was hot, but this cloud would keep them tempered. And so there was God's guidance and protection. And so there's also, if you pay attention, and it's I don't know if I'd call it a game, but for me it was, I gamify everything. So, you know, um, it's a game to kind of figure out the cluster of evidence that God is just dropping all around you, because usually it just drops all around you. And I'll give you an example, right? So I had a dream recently that I told you about. I've been missing my best friend. I don't know what's going on with him. I don't know what's happened with him. I haven't heard from him in a very long time, and I'm worried about him. So that's one side of it. So he shows up in a dream. And even though I do miss him, right? I know that it's more so the message of what he was saying that that was important, not so much who was saying it, right? So what was happening in the dream was all of these things were happening in the world. There was going to be a big fight, and all of the heavy hitters were dropping in. And so they were just dropping into the situation, dropping into the scenario, and they were ready to fight. And so, and I wasn't in that group. So more importantly, I was in the civilian group that was being, you know,
Ushered to safety.
ushered to safety, and I'm like, "What do you mean
When
ushered to
did I leave
safety?
the fight?
When did I stop being
Wow.
one of the guys that's getting jumped in here? One of the guys that's jumping into the fight, and that's what he was telling me in the dream. He was like, um, and that was the context that I knew him. Yes, it was, we would go on adventures and all of that stuff together, but it was also the fact that we were in the fight together. We were both soldiers, so to speak, in the army of the Lord, right? And so, but in the dream and in real life, like, I was out of the fight. So that is a piece. Now, how do I know that that is? Because dreams are the most ineffective way to really determine God's will, right? The most effective being the Bible, right? The Bible is the most surefire way to know God's will, right? And dreams being like at the far end of like very unreliable because it could be anything.
Mhm.
Okay. But when you see things in clusters, then you see, okay, well, there was a dream and there was a scripture and maybe somebody spoke a word and maybe you're at church and you hear a sermon and the message, the Holy Spirit speaks to you and maybe your spouse mentions something. So like there's always this cluster, like, and you look at it as pieces. And when you see that the message is repetitive, then you know that the Spirit is trying to communicate with you. And then it's like, okay, I need to go into my closet and pray, right? Because it could just be that it's alarms like, oh, this will get your attention and this will get your attention. And quite frankly, sometimes that'll be bad things that happen, right? Because if God can't get your attention that way, he's going to allow certain things to happen so that he gets your attention. In fact, we see that often, like in Isaiah and Jeremiah, where he says, and I allowed you to go hungry, and I allowed this sickness or this disease to come in, and I allowed these people to come and invade, and you still didn't turn to me. And so, what's the subtext there? The subtext there is that God's intention was for them to turn to him. That was the intention. And he tried to get their attention the positive way. And then he tried to get their attention through the other ways, which is letting the hardship come. But they still weren't turning to him. They still weren't, he wasn't getting their attention. And so, like, I think that God tries to get our attention through these clusters of things that happen. And then we can either respond depending on how deep we are or how far away we are, or so that may require some more prompting. But if you, going back to the first point, had developed a habit of looking for the promptings of the Spirit, then you're going to respond quickly, And if you don't, then it's going to take more cluster. But if you look back at the pattern, you'll notice that there's always a pattern. There's always what I call a cloud
Yeah.
of
I
of
could
of
see that.
of promptings, from God, So it's always going to be at the sources, the reliable sources. So it'll be the word. It's going to be godly people. So in whether that's a sermon, preaching, messages, the Spirit speaks to your heart through worship sessions and prayer and meditation and through the word as well from preaching, but also from godly people that come and tap you on the shoulder and talk to you, your spouse, if your spouse is a believer, and then of course at the very end of it, it's going to be dreams and visions.
Wow. Or
So I'm sorry. So that goes back to like, well, how would you know then? How would you know to like, okay, this is the promised land. Now, how can you be certain in going and taking it? And the reality is that it's never like devoid of uncertainty. There is a factor of faith and belief. You have to trust and you have to believe. And I would say that for me, it's drawing from the past. So drawing from what I know God has done and knowing that that same person exists today and will be with me in this future endeavor. And that's kind of like, well, first of all, I need to know that if it's from God.
yeah.
Once I've confirmed that, then it's just a matter of, well, it's if it's God, then there's no doubt we're gonna get through this, whether no matter what comes. Like we're going through.
I'm gonna jump to the fact that you said you see that often with like Jeremiah and Isaiah and the prophets, where they had already taken the land by that point. and you had generations and generations growing, and they were departing from God. So I want to move this from something that um that's more personal, right? Perhaps because then I read the Bible. I read the Bible, and Moses was literally talking to God. And every step of the way, God had shown and backed Moses up. So we knew that he was hearing from God. So what are you doing? That you're like, yeah, no, we're not doing that, or we're doing this. And so that was having to ignore God talking. But sometimes now, and I mean, because when they were asked to leave, it was always let my people go. It wasn't just let my people go. It's let my people go so that they may worship me. The ultimate reason why God was rescuing his people was so that they could worship him. So I feel like if I'm going to take all the liberty and take that and apply it to my life, a lot of my life, a lot of your life, a lot of our lives walking as Christians is taking those promised land, the taking over the promised land that God is giving you. Whether that is you have this God given desire to become a missionary and you do all the things and then you show up not treating the missionary work as the mission field as the finish line. But now I'm crossing in, expect a fight to take it over. So that you may worship him and through it all. But people like me, like I wanted to get married and I wanted to start a family and I wanted a godly family. And so I did the thing, went to church, met myself a cute Christian man who loved God, and by the grace of God, he liked me too. And we got married and we started a family, right? So that's the promised land. And this is where my immaturity has come into our marriage. I thought, well, I did it right because I had tons of heartbreak pre-marriage, pre-Christ, because I was choosing people and relationships and situations that weren't glorifying God. I was ignoring every kind of huge red flags in relationships and jumping headfirst because, I don't know. I didn't grow up with a dad. Whatever
You
excuse you
were
want to
you
put.
were a child at the time with very little guidance,
Yes. Yes.
like a sheep
Without a shepherd.
without a shepherd.
So the point there is that I thought very naively that once I crossed the finish line to marriage in a godly marriage of a godly man, that I was just going to be given the promised land. Meaning, no longer gonna fight because Christian people don't fight. We're never gonna have disagreements because Christian people don't have disagreements. And we've been together for 14 years. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Turns out, did you know that I brought my flesh to this marriage? I don't know if you've noticed, but I kind of did. I keep it in a corner somewhere. And I think that that's where this topic gets tricky for me and for a lot of us, right? Because I hear this often in Christian circles where it's kind of like if it got too hard, then it wasn't God's will. If it got too difficult, that God wouldn't have brought me here. But it reminds me that he's the one that brought. The biggest fight wasn't Pharaoh. Their biggest fight wasn't even the Red Sea. Their biggest fight was yet to come. And he allowed the time in the desert so they knew where their help came from, so that when they stepped into the actual fight where they were at, they were the ones who were going to have to pick up arms. They knew where the power was going to come from. And that's the lesson that I feel like I'm wrestling with now. And where we believe in God. We believe that he can. I believe 100% that I can get on your nerves. I don't have that fear that I once did of if we fight too much or whatever, like you're not going anywhere. And there's commitment, there's safety in this marriage. But that doesn't give me license to um not crucify my flesh and then abuse my relationship because well we're bound together. And I think a lot of abuse has happened within marriages because if you're Christian you can't get a divorce, and so nobody tries to be like Christ and nobody crucifies their flesh. Nobody's into the sanctification sense. You can't go anywhere. I can do and act however I want. So today, I feel that that's one of our biggest fights. I mean, make it clear. Have you heard of people who are Christians who talk about their marriage as an option? Like, it got hard, so, you know, God has a better man or a better woman for me out there. And what do you think about that? In the context of staying together and fighting for the promised land, because I think that it comes from that. If it got hard, then it wasn't God's will. But by that math, then when it got hard for us, when we were, building a life together, then it wasn't God's will. We should have walked away, but we didn't. And every single time that we get to one of those spots where things get hard, we fight through it. We fight together. We go to God. And once we're on the other side, there's more intimacy, there's more growth. We're like, oh, yeah, it looked hard. It looked like, what happened? Did we hear wrong? But then God had something better. We grow as people, we mature. Um, do you think there's any kind of correlation? Well, maybe people see it like me, that if there's difficulty, then God is not in it.
Yeah, so I think that that's a very immature way of seeing life in general, because there's no evidence in the Bible that suggests that. All the opposite, actually. They don't go from Egypt to the promised land. They go from Egypt to the desert. And that's something that I say a lot because it's a principle, right? And there's a utility in that because like you mentioned, there's stuff that has to die. And in the desert is where death happens, right? And so there's a baptism, so to speak, that happens, a transformative process. And your spouse is supposed to be that. Your spouse is supposed to be a rival to an extent, which is what the Bible, when the Bible calls the spouse the ideal helper, right? It uses the same language that the Bible uses to refer to God. Because so God is the ideal helper and woman is the ideal helper. And what does that mean? And it's the language entails struggle. The language entails a wrestling, right? It's Jacob wrestling with God. It's the spouse wrestling with the other, right? And it's not so much a violent thing. It's just the fact that your spouse knows the truest version of yourself. And because they know the truest version of yourself, it's like those Russian dolls, right? You're exposing more and more and more and more and more of yourself. And as you do, stuff comes up. And as stuff comes up, you can't hide it from your spouse. So that level of accountability forces you into intimacy because it's what real love is. Real love is being known and being accepted. And so to be known and to be accepted means that all the things that you're hiding come out. And as the truest form of you is revealed, then those parts can be accepted. There are some things that have to die. So it's not just accepting everything, right? It's though there are things that will just have to be put away. But that's also part of the redemptive process. And it's like Deuteronomy chapter 8. I always come back to that because it's such a pivotal thing. It reveals to us what the purpose of the desert is. It says, I made you go hungry. I made you all of those things. I fed you manna, but I made you go hungry, right? It was like so that you would know what was in your heart, right? We came into marriage and we were kids at the time, essentially. And what the heck do we know? What the heck did we know, right?
I didn't.
We didn't know. We didn't know who we really were. We didn't know what we were, we had facades and it's like, the theory of fragmentation and defragmentation of personality. We were still forming who we were essentially and we hadn't even begun to understand the layers that we had put up in order to protect ourselves from troubled teenage years, and so that begins to unravel within the context of the relationship and you're literally watching a person's metamorphosis happen live and that's not always pretty. So there's just no evidence in the Bible to suggest that there's going to be a direct, if God gave it to you, then it's going to be perfect and 100%, thing. It's a gift and it's a great thing, but you and God don't have to agree on what good looks like, you know? The Bible is very clear about that. It says, my ways are not your ways, right? My thoughts are not your thoughts. God sees the end from the beginning, and he sees the enemy that you're facing before you do. He's aware of who you really are before you are. So he knows the things that have to come up and have to be dealt with. So I don't believe that there was ever a promise that once we got married and I believe that you were the perfect person for me, and I still do to this day, 14 years later. I don't believe that it was going to be just this, perfect path, and that you were going to be because I'm not perfect, right? And the thing is that I was aware of all the snakes hiding inside, right? And to be quite honest, there was a lot of them that I wasn't even aware of. I just recently, decided to walk into the deepest, darkest part of the forest of my inner self, and start to like look at some of these things that I've been avoiding for in some cases over 30 years. So ooh, just made me emotional. So, the reality is that if I didn't know who I was when we first got married, and you didn't know who you were when we first got married, and on top of that, we've had several like world-changing events happen to us, like having kids, like beating cancer, like all of those things. It's like, like career shifts and moving states and all of the things that we've experienced together. It's like that's life. You didn't commit to perfection, you committed to aiming for the promised land, right? Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, right? But there's a reason why Jesus gives them that prayer as a daily thing, and why he says, give us this day our daily bread. And the kingdom come is framed within the context of a daily request. Make your kingdom come today, the principles of your kingdom today. And that's what makes it worthwhile, that we're both aiming in the same direction. That direction is the kingdom of God. And that's what makes it good, right? Because that won't change. Once the second coming of Jesus Christ, once the clouds open up and the rocks, once all of that happens, right? The kingdom will finally come. But it's like, no, the kingdom's been here
Yeah.
all along. So,
Yeah. Oof. The kingdom has been here. That's that's a lovely that's a lovely way of seeing it. I don't want to start another different thing, but I think it's all in the same vein. Um our relationships here, our world here, our life here can start pointing us and can start transforming us to be more like Christ. Or we can, in an immature way, like I've struggled, um, implant things that the Bible never said and impute things to God that He never promised. He never said that there wouldn't be trouble. He actually said there would be trouble, but that we don't have to worry because we're not going to be alone and because He's already beaten it. I guess that this will be my last question, and I hope I can ask it correctly. Ooh, sorry.
God bless you.
If Jesus already won, why do we keep struggling with sin and in the flesh? He won. He defeated death. He defeated sin. He defeated all the things. Now we're Christians, new creation. Why does my flesh keep popping up?
Well, I think it's Paul that says I die daily, right? Um, there is a cross to bear here. And part of the reason why we need to bear it daily is um, because we're still within this side of eternity. Like this is not the kingdom yet. The principles of the kingdom can be applied here, and we can live as emissaries of the kingdom here. Um, but there is a kingdom to come where that's gone, right? But we still have a sinful nature, right? That's what the psalmist says. In sin was I conceived, and in sin my mother gave birth to me. And he's not referring to sex, or he's not referring to um, conception or that being evil. That's not what that's about. It's more so the fact that that is the nature of the world that we live in. And I'll add, it's becoming more and more difficult to discern truth from error. It's becoming more and more difficult to discern what is right and what is wrong. And so we wrestle on this side. This is not the end game. This is not where we end up. This is not how things end up. But for now, this is what we must do. We must wrestle. So, um, although our marriage is 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 the best preamble of eternity to come and the glory that God has for us, um, to quote the name of the podcast, right? It's heaven in our home, right? But it's not the full extension of what God has for us. It's just an appetizer, for greater things, more than the eye has seen, more than the imagination has imagined, more than the ears have heard or the senses have experienced. Such are the glories that await for us. And that sounds so foreign to say. you know it kind of sounds like telling somebody, we saw the land and it was beautiful. It flowed milk and honey, and there were fruit that were the size of people. But in order to get there, there's going to be some giants on the way. And those giants come in the form of baggage, unresolved trauma, addictions, hurt, habits, hangups, mental illness, unexpected death, sadness, depression. So, you know,
So fight. Don't stand and question God. Just step in, choose every day to that die to self, pick up
Mhm.
your cross and follow him. It's worth it.
Right. I just made a video on this, right? The key, and maybe it was just a message for myself, you know. I think it's a misunderstanding to think that you're going to get through this on your own, that you have to be strong, and that you have to be a good Christian in order to, whatever it is, right? You have to be weak, because when I am weak, 2 Corinthians, right? Chapter 12. When I am weak, then I am strong. So it is through weakness that we conquer. It is through weakness that we take the giants. Because in weakness, and that's probably the most important part of the desert, it's really surrendering and admitting we are weak so that we can be made strong, so that God can say, all right, I'll step in and I'll do this. There were cities that were taken in Canaan where there was zero fighting on the part of the Israelites. Zero. Where the enemies fled and fought themselves, confused, thinking that the Israelites were upon them. Where hail the size of minivans would fall down and crush the enemy. So yes, they did fight. It's like, yeah, they did fight, but it was
They
like,
showed up. They fought themselves to show up with
it was,
no
yeah,
weapons to places where people
yeah,
could just
yeah.
break them apart.
You think Gideon, where they didn't show up with weapons. They showed up with a pot. They showed up with musical instruments. Like they didn't show up with, and they showed up with a group of 300 people to fight what was called at the time a swarm, an enemy that was so large they were compared to locusts, the way that they would swarm. and they got there with 300 men, and they had
The original 300.
the original 300, and they had pots,
And a lantern.
a lantern, for crying out loud. Like, they didn't come to fight, but the enemy ended up fighting themselves, and they killed each other off, and then they ran away. So, yes, be brave and take the land, but understand that it's God that gives you the victory. All you have to do is point in that direction. And if you do, just point in that direction and surrender to God, He will give you the victory. And He will see you through it. And I believe that has to do with just God forming in us a spirit that is willing to follow no matter what. So, narrow way, right?
Yep.
He didn't promise the wide way. The wide way would be easy. He says, easy.
Looks easy.
Yeah, looks
Looks
easy. Jesus says, wide is the way that leads to destruction, but
Yeah.
narrow is the way that leads to salvation. So hardship is part and parcel of all this.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for having this conversation with me.
You're welcome.
I hope that you guys got something out of it. I know that I did. And let's continue in the fight. Is there anything else that you would like to say? And the fight that's already happening, because God is fighting in us and through us. And sorry.
Yeah,
Takes a lot.
the fight, the only thing that I would want to add to that is you're not fighting your spouse. You're not fighting your kids. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. And that's the mistake. I lose sight of that, sometimes, because for me, especially when we have arguments, I want there to be somebody that's right and somebody that's wrong, right? And that, said another way, is for there to be a winner and for there to be a loser. But we're not fighting each other. We're fighting an enemy that is, not flesh and blood. Principalities is what the Bible tells us in the New Testament, right? So, keeping in mind that that's our fight, and that's truly what we're battling against, and then staying in it. Don't quit. Stay in it. So that's it.
Don't be a quitter. Alrighty. Thank you so much. And we'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.